Okay, welcome to this week's Parsha Shiur, Parsha's Chukas, and we're going to focus on two very interesting themes and quite important, Yesodistic, meaty themes related to this week's Parsha. If you're listening online, please email me at j.golker@gmail.com. I'll send you the handout. For those in the room, you have the handout in front of you. Look at the first box, please. The Pasuk says, Zois Chukas HaTorah Asher Tziva Hashem Leimor. This is the chayk of the Torah. There is one word which appears once a year, and always at this time of year in reference to this parsha, and that is quintessential. It always appears, the quintessential chayk of the Torah is referring to Parah Adumah. Now, there is a very famous Beis Halevi, and it's very fundamental and very important. It's not here in Parshas Chukas, it's all the way back at the beginning of Sefer Shmos in Parshas Bai, and it talks about one of the V'Higalta Lebincha, the response to one of the sons. And the Beis Halevi discusses the concept of mitzvahs, and he actually makes reference to the Parah Adumah, which is one of the main themes of this week's Sedra. And because it's such a fundamental Beis Halevi, touching on such interesting and important ideas, which people, I think it's important for us to understand, it's worth exploring it inside. So I haven't got the whole Beis Halevi, but I've taken the main and key points from it. So let's work through. Says the Beis Halevi, Omnam, Yosin near da Parsha Ari ben Godel, or Melumet Hayudeh in Yitzias Mitzrayim. The Parsha of V'Higalta Lebincha Bayom Hahulema Bar Vuzel Hashem Li B'Seitzim Mitzrayim in Parshas Bai is talking about an adult child who understands what Yitzias Mitzrayim is, V'Hanissim Shenasu Oz, and all the miracles that happened at the time of Yitzias Mitzrayim. Rak Libay Not Letzat Haminim. But we're talking about the Rasha, the son whose heart is wayward. He's heading towards Apikorasim, V'Hamischakmim, and those who sort of see themselves as enlightened, V'Oimrim Tamim LeMitzvahs, and they give all of these interests. They say that they're all interesting reasons for mitzvahs. V'Achrei Sheyamtziu Eize Tam She'eina Shaykh Bizmanom, and since they say, well, if the reason for a mitzvah is X, Y, or Z, and that was limited to a specific time, but now the reason doesn't apply, and therefore they say, well, this mitzvah no longer applies. That is what some people will say. And this Rasha, this V'Higalta Lebincha you're addressing, is of that mind. U'k'moi kas ha-reform, says the Beis Halevi, of course, living in the mid-1800s, when the reform movement was emerging. He says this is really what the reform movement is saying. They're erroneous in their thinking. They say that certain mitzvahs are limited by time. That mitzvah was applicable back in the day, at that time period, but not nowadays. So therefore we can ditch whatever it is, X, Y, or Z, this mitzvah or that mitzvah. Iraq, was limited to a specific place, for Medina or that country, and not here in Germany or in wherever else. Their warped thinking. I don't even go down that route and start exploring and talking about them too much, says the Beis Halevi. And by the way, if you think this is limited to the 19th century, I remember a conversation I had with a fellow who was a professor of law. He was actually Jewish, as so happens, and was a very nice person, was not religious in any way. And he asked me in a sort of a pleasant way the following question. He said to me, look, you don't eat shellfish, do you? He said to me, he was a secular Jew, and he said to me as a religious Jew, he says, you don't eat shellfish, do you? So I said, no. So he said, no crabs, lobsters, and oysters, and these things? No. So he said, why is it? So I said, because you're familiar with kashrus. The Torah says there are certain things you can eat, certain things you can't eat, and seafood, shellfish, and things you can't eat. So he said to me, can I suggest something to you? I said, go ahead. He said that the Jews were in the wilderness for 40 years. There was no refrigeration, and therefore it was very dangerous, shellfish, to eat that type of food without refrigeration is very dangerous. But nowadays, in the 21st century, we have refrigeration, and therefore he posits that shellfish and seafood should all be now allowed for the Jewish diet. That's exactly what the Beis Halevi is saying. he is giving reasons for the mitzvah. He says that the reason why shellfish is not allowed is because it can go bad and there's no refrigeration and it's unhealthy, and therefore nowadays it's okay. The premise of his error is he understands the reasons for the mitzvahs. Says the Beis Halevi, that's exactly that's what we were telling the Ben Harosha. That's not what really Torah is about, as we'll see. Next paragraph. And therefore our response to this argument is, you can sort of tell him back, you literally knock his teeth out, but it means in a very robust way, because of this, HaKadosh Baruch Hu did for me as I left Egypt. And this is the response to that argument of those apikarsim. For who? And that is the afagav the tam ze emes the pesach she'os yisrael b'mitzrayim b'shas ma'aseh hoisa hanoira lebitl avodah shlehem. True. The reason why we did the Korban Pesach and all of that was to negate the idolatry of the time in Egypt. But that's not the only reason why we do it. That's perhaps a reason. But there could be many reasons and perhaps not the reason. Interestingly, when the Sefer HaChinuch, the classic work, which goes through all the reasons for all 613 mitzvahs and details of them, one of the classic works of one of the Rishonim, and he goes through a bar mitzvah present for his son. His son was becoming bar mitzvah, and he says, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to write you a book going through the details of all 613 mitzvahs, giving the reasons for them. But he never says that the reason is X, Y, or Z. He always says, Misherish ha-mitzvah, perhaps the root of the mitzvah is, because that's the key point, perhaps. We don't know for certainty. And that's what tamei ha-mitzvahs are. Tamei ha-mitzvahs are to give a taste for it. A reason and taste is the same word, tam. So we're giving reasons, but it's just to give more meaning and flavor to the actual performance of a mitzvah. When you explore in the depth of the mitzvah of tefillin, for example, you put on tefillin, it's a different world. But we're not suggesting that we know absolutely the reason for the mitzvah. There could be many, and there could be many which we just are not aware of. For who? Next paragraph in the Beis Halevi, third paragraph. For who? To gamba mitzvahs she'anu yoidin bohem hatam, even the mitzvahs that we seemingly know the reason for it. Hatam k'mo b'matzah, for example, matzah. Why do we eat matzah? She'omri botam shelo hispik b'tzeikom shlavasenu lahach mitzad shegoalom. That they came out of Mitzrayim and the matzah couldn't raise properly and develop into a proper dough. V'chein morar, and so to morar. To remember how the Mitzrayim embittered our lives, or Pesach al sheposach abot avoseihem, avosenu. These are all very nice reasons, but not necessarily the reason. And it's not because of this that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us this particular mitzvah. That we shouldn't be ingrates. Next paragraph. For example, Chazal say, some people say that the only reason we eat matzah is to commemorate the fact that when we came out of Mitzrayim, the matzah, the dough that was on their backs, didn't rise properly into proper bread, and it was matzah. But that's not the essential, real reason for this mitzvah. Here, listen to this. The reasoning is that the Torah preceded the world. It was the blueprint of creation. And therefore, you can't suggest that the reason why we eat matzah on Pesach is because the dough didn't rise on their backs, because the Torah preceded the creation of the world, and the mitzvah of matzah was already in the Torah. Many, many centuries before the world, before Yetzias Mitzrayim even happened. And therefore the Torah preceded the world. And in it is the mitzvah of matzah. We know there are many examples of how the Avos kept all of the Torah, including Seder night. And there are many instances of this. So if Avram Avinu, Sarah was baking matzahs on the nights of the brachas with Yaakov and Esav, that Yitzchak asked for Shnei Gediyim, Korban Pesach and Chagiga. What do you mean Korban Pesach? They're eating matzahs, but Yetzias Mitzrayim hadn't happened yet. So what's going on? who belel tezva b'Nisan ochel Avram matzah on the night of the 15th of Nisan. Avram Avinu ate matzah umarer afagav also kodim Golas Mitzrayim, even though it was of course centuries before Golas Mitzrayim. So you see, it cannot be that because they ate matzah and maror, we eat matzah and maror because we came out of Mitzrayim. Then why did Avram Avinu do it? He lived before Yetzias Mitzrayim. Next paragraph. V'zeu b'chlal b'chol tamei mitzvahs, and that's true for all of the tamei mitzvahs. The lo b'shvil hatam nasa mitzvah. It's chicken and egg. It's not because of this reason we keep the mitzvah. It's not because that the dough didn't rise we keep the mitzvah of matzah. Rak lehepach. The ba'avur ha-mitzvah ba'atam. The mitzvah came first. There is something inherently important about eating matzah on the night of Pesach. There is something important about eating maror and korban Pesach and everything else. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu just made the circumstances as a catalyst for that situation. Do you understand? So therefore, first of all, you have the reason, and that precedes the world. That's in the Torah, which precedes the creation of the world. And then you have a catalyst, an event, a trigger event, such as Yetzias Mitzrayim, such as the dough not rising, which is the trigger to then sort of for everyone to keep the mitzvah. But Avram Avinu, for example, who is so spiritually sensitive, he can understand and tap in to the mitzvah even before it's given. You hear that? It's a fundamental concept. Next line. In other words, because of the keeping of the mitzvah of that night, they were zocher to be redeemed. בפומבי לאין כל, ולאחר אז כאב לשיינו וכן בכל המצווס, ובזה נסתרו כל חקירוסם של הרשע. And that concept, that we're not keeping the mitzvahs because of this specific reason or that specific reason, which leads to the argument, well, when that mitzvah, that reason goes, then the mitzvah goes, that concept, the negation of that argument, destroys the whole theology. That gone is the argument that if the tam has gone away, the mitzvah has gone away as well. And therefore the mitzvah is eternal. We don't know the rationale necessarily for each mitzvah, and therefore it transcends time. And with this we can explain, I'm in the penultimate paragraph, now we can understand the continuation of the pasuk. What's pshat? The afal gav the heim mitzvah sichlius acha shechit shelatam ba min mitzvah, even though they're logical mitzvahs, shechidesh lo hatam, that the Torah tells me the reason. Imkein ha mitzvah ba'atzma hi chuka v'kiyim la'olam yom yomim b'lo hefsek gam sheyischadish ein zman shelo yishayich hatam hanoyadim. And therefore, even though the tam may go away, because this is a chayk which is lasting forever, we still keep the mitzvah. And that is really the response to the Rasha. Last paragraph. What's this got to do with Paraduma? With all of the above, says the Beis Halevi, this explains the Medrash at the beginning of this week's Sedra. The Medrash explains that La'asid Lavai, in times to come, when Mashiach will come, Yiskalu Tamim Shapara Aduma. The Torah, or the Mashiach, whoever, will reveal the reasons for the mitzvah. And all the chukim, all the statutes of the Torah. That the time will come where HaKadosh Baruch Hu can reveal all the reasons for the mitzvahs. And like some Kubalim, says the Beis Halevi, writes and give you a little inkling, a flavor of some of the mystical reasons that we're not so familiar with. In Yoni Mitzvah Zeilu, Vermizo Sehem, and the allusions and hints, V'niskale Rak K'tzas, and only a small amount has been revealed. V'kula Gam Atza Nisha Ne'ela Me'ein Kol Chai. And all of it is hidden from us. V'shari HaMitzvah Sh'legia Adayin HaZman, She'eh Pulos V'niglis V'niris, B'ze'elim V'shmurim D'oz Yiskale Le'ein Kol. So, says the Beis Halevi very powerfully, that the Medrash in the beginning of Parshas Chukas is telling us that La'asid Lava, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will reveal the reasons for the mitzvahs, at least some of them. And therefore, for us, in this stage of the game, pre-Moshiach, we shouldn't make the error of thinking that we understand the reasons for the mitzvahs. And even the mitzvahs which we're given the reasons for. For example, eating matzah on Pesach. Because that leads to the wrong conclusion that if the reason is gone, then the chiyuv for the mitzvah is gone as well. That's not true. And just like with Parah Aduma, there's loads of rationales and reasons that we're not aware of, that Lasid Lavo will hopefully find out about. Well, so too all the mitzvahs. And like the Chinuch says, Misherish HaMitzvah, we can conjecture, we can suggest reasons and rationales, but don't make the mistake of that jump to say this is the reason, because that's just erroneous. Because once the reason is gone, then you just discard the mitzvah, which is of course wrong. So it's a very fundamental Beis Halevi in our understanding of Tamei mitzvahs, which of course talks about Zois Chukas HaTorah, the quintessential chayk of the Parah Aduma, that even that one, there we just simply don't know the reasons, although there are lots of suggested reasons. But the absolute reason is known only to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and perhaps Lasid Lavo will be revealed to us. Okay, let's press on. Now, the next theme, if you like, the major theme in this week's Sedra is Mei Meriva. Listen carefully. Mei Meriva is a famous Parsha in Torah where Moshe Rabbeinu is held to account. Now, what exactly did Moshe Rabbeinu do wrong? Let's take a look. Let's read the Pesukim in the bottom box. Vayeshev ha'am. Look inside. Vayeshev ha'am b'Kadesh. And the people were dwelling in Kadesh. Vatomos sham Miriam. And then Miriam died. Vatikover sham, and she was buried there. V'lo hoya mayim lo eda. And there wasn't water. Vayikolu al Moshe v'Aaron. And people gathered around Moshe and Aaron. They were thirsty. They were complaining. Vayidab Hashem al Moshe leiman. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Moshe, saying, Kach es hamate. Take your staff, your stick. V'hakel es ha'eda atov Aaron achicha, and gather Aaron, you and Aaron your brother, gather the people. V'dibartem el hasela, and speak to the rock. Le'ineihem v'nosa meimov, and the rock will give water to the people. V'yom Elohim shimunu ha'merim, and Moshe Rabbeinu then addresses the people very robustly and says, Shimunu ha'merim, listen, you rebellious people. Hamin hasela hazeh noitz lochem mayim, will I be able to extract water from this rock? Vayorem Moshe es yoda vayaches hasela, and he hit the rock. B'mateu pamoy vayetzu mayim rabim, and much water came, many waters came out. Vatesh to Edo v'Eram, and he gave the Edo, the congregation, and their flock to drink. Listen to this. Says the pasuk. Vayoyim Hashem al Moshe ve'Aaron yan lo hemantem bi lagdisheni le'nei kol Yisrael. Because you didn't use the opportunity to sanctify me, to make a kiddush Hashem in the eyes of the Jewish people, lochein lo sovies hakol hazel haaretz. Therefore, you will not go into Eretz Yisrael, asher nosati lahem, which I gave to them. Heiva meimeriva asher ravu b'nei Yisrael, es Hashem vayikodesh bom. That is the parsha of Meimeriva. I've, of course, cut out various psukim, but that's the key aspects of Meimeriva. Now, many opinions are given to what actually Moshe Rabbeinu did wrong, but it's unclear. There are many, 15, 20 amongst the Rishonim and others, as to what actually Moshe Rabbeinu did wrong. In other words, his error is so minor, is so slight, that it's not clear what it even is. The Rashi seems to be of the opinion, Rashi says, that instead of speaking to the rock, he hit the rock. The Rambam says, Shimun HaMeirim, that he spoke too robustly to the Jewish people. Rashi then says, well, what if it's Lahag Desheni, what would have been the Kiddush Hashem that would have ensued? Says Rashi, She'ilu Dibartim El Hasela, had you spoken to the rock, I would have been more sanctified in the eyes of the people. If this rock, which cannot hear and cannot speak, and doesn't need sustenance, doesn't need parnasa, does the will of God by producing water, how much more so we should listen to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You missed the opportunity for people to make that conclusion, and that's a lost Kiddush Hashem. Fine. That's Rashi. The Rambam, as I said, Shimun HaMeirim. There is a shitta of the Rabbi Yosef Albai. Rabbi Yosef Albai, and this famous Sefer Ikrim, he was one of the Rishonim. He lived in 1380 to 1444. He says an amazing thing. Now, I came across this in an email. I don't know when I received it, many years ago, from an email that I was on a list of whatever and I got from Rabbi Franz, and he says something fascinating. And we've quoted in previous Parsha the Sefer Ikrim, but I've got a fabulous postscript to it, because the Sefer Ikrim says something which I'll explain to you in a second, but there needs some sort of explanation. Let's take a look at the Sefer Ikrim. The Sefer Ikrim is perhaps most famous for his he sort of sets out three tenets of Emunah, which is often referred to, and it's very important, Yedias Klolis, to know this. The three tenets of Emunah of the Sefer Ikrim. One is the Metzias Hashem, the existence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There's Turim Min Shamayim and Schar Va'inish. Those are the three tenets of Emunah that the Sefer Ikrim sets out. Let's take a look at how the Sefer Ikrim deals with Mei Meriva. Take a look. Harbe Nevoichu HaParshim HaMefarshim B'Biyah HaChet Mei Meriva. Many of the Mefarshim sort of spill a lot of ink on the paper to try and figure out what was the chait of Moshe Rabbeinu Mei Meriva, and many sort of scratch their heads wondering. The Rambam says, I think the only fault here was that Moshe Rabbeinu was too angry with the Jewish people. And says the Sefer HaIkrim, Rabbi Yosef Albo, let me suggest you my pshat. He's gonna also offer something. What is it? I think that the reason that Moshe Rabbeinu was guilty was because he didn't speak to the rock, like the Pasuk seems to suggest. And let me explain to you what the problem was. Not like Rashi, but I've got my own pshat. True, he didn't speak to the rock. Says the Sefer HaIkrim that one of the yesodus of Emunah is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, if you like, hands over, delegates power to a few yechidei segula, to some tzaddikim in every generation, that they have the capacity to control nature in every generation. And you see it with certain pious people down the generations. Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa, for example, the Gemara in Tanis and the Gemara in Brachas talks about the piety of Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa. And one example is the Gemara in Brachas Lamed Gimel, Sheniach Ragle al Chur ha'orot. The one time there was a very dangerous sort of lizard or snake that kept coming up and injuring people. And they came to Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa, and the Gemara says in Brachas, and they said, Rabbi, pray for us. This is a dangerous animal. It's causing havoc. So he said, where is it? He said, in that field over there. And he was sort of burrowed under the ground. So the Gemara says, what happened? Sheniach ragla lachur. Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa went over to the hole, and he put his foot on the hole. The noshcha ha'orad, and the orad bit him, or mesa orad, and the orad died. So that's one example. That's the exact opposite of what should have happened in the world of nature. And then he stood up in the base of Medrash afterwards, the Gemara says, and he stood up and said, my children, it's not the orad that kills, it's chait, it's sin, which causes death. That you see tzaddikim can control nature. And about the same person, Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa, the famous Gemara says in Tanis that when his daughter lit Shabbos candles and she by mistake put vinegar in instead of oil, so Rabbi Chanina says, what's the problem? The same God who says that oil should light will tell you that the vinegar will light. And many other instances throughout Shas. That many times that these great Tanoim can go to a river and can command the river to stop flowing. So you see that certain Yechidei Skula are in control of nature. If the Fine. Next paragraph. Look at this. And because Moshe and Aaron didn't do this, because they didn't speak to the rock and directly command it, says the Sefer HaIkrim, you know what the problem was? That they didn't demonstrate bailus, ownership, control over nature. That was Moshe Rabbeinu's chait. They should have just said, speak to the rock. That's contrary to nature. And if you would have commanded it to produce water, that would have demonstrated how some Yechidei Skula have total control over nature. They didn't do that, missed opportunity. That was the Chilul Hashem. Because it involved the Chilul Hashem. Chilul Hashem is the most serious Aveira. You can't get an atonement for it. The only way to atone for Chilul Hashem is not Yisurim, is not Tshuva, but ultimately is Misa. Only with a person's death does it go. And therefore, like a Gzar Din which has got a Shvuah, that therefore Moshe Rabbeinu's Tshuva didn't help. Should protect us from making similar errors which involve a Chilul Hashem. Ad Kan, the Sefer Ikrim. I get this email. I look at this email. I've kept it on my files for many years. Rabbi Franz said something fascinating. I don't think it's in any of his foreign, but he says the following. He had a question on this Sefer Ikrim. He got an assignment as a kid in school, in high school, as a young boy, just a year or two after the mitzvah, that the Rabbi distributed like an assignment that every kid in the class had to come up with a different rishon, a different pirush on what was the chait of Moshe Rabbeinu. So you got to do Rashi, you got to do the Ramban, you got to do the Rambam. Everyone's got their own mahalach. Rabbi Frand had to do the Sefer Ikrim. So this is what we just did. That throughout history, people of Sadiqim, individuals, a few Yechidei Segula, have got the ability to control nature, and Moshe Rabbeinu was included, and he should have used this opportunity to control nature by speaking to the rock to produce water. He didn't do it, Chilul Hashem. Rabbi Frand said he always had a question. He had this question for over 50 years. Can you imagine having a question for over 50 years? I have the Chukas learning with a very chashav chavrusa. And he told me some years ago, learned with him for many years, and he told me a few years ago that his son was learning Maseches Kiddush in a certain daf, I forget which. And he mentioned to his son, he goes, oh, there's a Rashi there which I've had trouble with for years. And his son was like blown away. You've got a difficulty with the Rashi, and you remember that daf. That's who we are. We have a question. We work on it. We don't succeed. Okay, maybe 50 years after my friend has this question on this Sefer Ikrim, he comes up with the answer. What's the question on the Sefer Ikrim? The question is very simple. That Moshe Rabbeinu was apparently guilty that he should have spoken to the rock and just did it himself. What did he do? He instead goes to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and says, they're thirsty, my sister's just died, there's tumult in the camp, what should I do? And he never did anything on his own. Every makkah, every time his staff turned to a snake, the frogs, the dams, vadei, kinim, all of them, it was only through HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So why now are you going to hold Moshe Rabbeinu guilty for not taking the initiative and just speaking to the rock and doing it himself? That wasn't the way he operated. He always went to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So what's the criticism? That was the kasha that my friend had on the Sefer Ikrim all the decades. Until he came to this Meshech Chochmah. Let's take a look at this Meshech Chochmah. And we'll finish with this, but let's go through it. It's very, very beautiful. Harav Yosef Elbay, he's quoting what we just did. Choshav ki chetz me merivahu al shel kiddush Moshe Shmei. That Moshe Rabbeinu wasn't mekadosh to Shem Hashem. Ki kasher ra ki ha'am tzoma l'mayim. When he saw the people were thirsty for water, hayaroyu leish kazeh lekadosh Shmei Yisbarach v'lasas me'altzon lohitz mayim misela. He should have been mekadosh Shem Shmei by just speaking to the rock, and water would have come out. V'Hashem yaser rosoin tzadik v'atzas avodav yashlim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu does the rotzen of the tzadikim. Tzadik goizer HaKadosh Baruch Hu mekayim. And many of the Chacham speak about it, but their Sfarim are not with me right now. Says the Meshech Chochmah, listen to this. Says the Meshech Chochmah, it's worth thinking. That the way Moshe operated was, he didn't just do things on his own back. All the moifsim that he did, Kamaimon, Veslav, the Be'er, the Kriyas Yamsuf. All of these amazing miracles, he just didn't do it on his own back. He did it first by asking HaKadosh Baruch Hu, what should I do? Yeah, with all the other greats in Jewish history, they just did it. But Moshe Rabbeinu had a different way of operating. He would speak to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and ask him what to do. With Yeshua, when it came to the Amidas Hashemesh, when the sun stood still, it just says that he just commanded it. And so to Elyon Har Carmel and Shmuel with the rain. The only time, does anybody know? The only time Moshe Rabbeinu intervened personally was with Korach in yesterday's Sedra. That he says that if Korach is right, then I'm there, I'm gone. And if I'm right, then Yiftach Ha'aretz, the land should open up, and this Misa, this unusual Misa that's never happened until now. So that's the only time that he didn't consult HaKadosh Baruch Hu first. V'nira b'zeh, next paragraph. Ki novi acher shehasagoso eina b'spaklare me'ira. Listen to this, amazing insight. What was the difference between the Nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu and other Nevi'im? Other Nevi'im saw things in a bit of a haze. They sort of got like a trance from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They got a Nevuah, and they were sort of in this sort of state of a trance. They convulsed on the ground almost. But Moshe Rabbeinu was pe'er daber boy. There was aspaklaria hame'ira. There was clear vision with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Says the Pesach Chochma, V'nir b'zeh ki novi acher shasagoso ein b'aspaklaria hame'ira. Any other novi didn't have that clarity of prophecy that he had with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. V'nevuah sohayu k'mishtageya. He's like deranged almost. He loses all physicality. Everyone can see, listen carefully, this is the main point, that this is not HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, they won't confuse him with a deity. Everyone will see that a Novi is getting a Nevuah right now because he's in a trance, he's sort of convulsing on the floor, he's like having some sort of seizure. And this is communion coming from HaKadosh Baruch Hu directly to this Novi. Loi kein Moshe. Not so with Moshe Rabbeinu. Ki hu nishar b'chushav, because he stands in total calm. U'medaber ka'adam im chaveiroi, and he's like talking to another human being. U'chmayim apostle, like the apostle says, pe el pe adaber boy. Ilu haya oisakein. If the danger of Moshe Rabbeinu having this perfect nevuah is that he's like a deity, he's like a god. With any other novi, they're lying. I know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is giving them the nevuah. They're not going anywhere. They know that they won't confuse that these other nevi'im are going to be like gods. But Moshe Rabbeinu, maybe people will make that confused assumption. Since it will be very easy to make that mistake, to think that Moshe Rabbeinu is some form of deity, to avoid that mistake, Moshe Rabbeinu didn't do anything off his own back. He didn't initiate and command nature, because people might come to the conclusion that he is a god. And therefore, and therefore he didn't do anything without HaKadosh Baruch Hu commanding him beforehand. And then people will realize that this person is Ish Moshe. It's actually, he's a human being, because he's got to consult with God every time he does a miracle. The only exception was the situation with Korach. Why? Because, think about it, guys, think about this. Why was the one time that Moshe Rabbeinu didn't consult Hashem? Why was it safe to do so with Korach? The answer is this. Because in all other times, Moshe Rabbeinu was worried. People will think, HaKadosh Baruch Hu talks to me, I'm not convulsing on the floor, I'm not in a trance, I'm talking to him like a normal person would talk to another person. People will make a mistake that I'm a God, I'm a deity. So therefore, I'm not going to do anything without discussing with HaKadosh Baruch Hu first, requesting it. People are saying to me, let me speak to Hashem, let me speak to Hashem. And therefore, people won't make the mistake that he's a deity. But with Korach, no one's going to make that mistake anyway. Why? Because what are they saying? They're challenging his leadership. Ka'am kakoyin kakotin kagodel hechishu malas Moshe v'chashtu b'dvarim pechusim. They're coming along and they're questioning Moshe Rabbeinu's leadership and his role as leader. So no one's going to. They're not confusing him with the deity. Therefore, and therefore, Oz. No one's going to confuse him as a deity in the case of Korach. And therefore it was safe to just go ahead and shoot and say, let the ground open up and swallow Korach and his men. Because no one's going to confuse him with a deity then, because they're questioning his leadership. Ulam, Achshav, but now, last paragraph. Since last week's Sedra, he had demonstrated with Korach he's acting on his own initiative. Now there is no water for the people. And what are the complainers going to say? People will say, he's worried about his own covet now. But when there was no water for the people, now he's not worried. He's running back to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, they're complaining about the water. Miriam's just died. The be'er's dried up. What should I do? There is a potential Chil Hashem. Because last week, they say, Moshe Rabbeinu, when it came to Korach, you just acted. You did something. Why didn't you do it this week? Why are you asking HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Now, we know the answer. The real answer is, because with Korach, there was no fear of him acting on his own bat, independently. But in all other situations, he was scared to do so because they might think he's a deity. But people would not understand that. And there'll be a potential Chil Hashem. People will say, yeah, he's worried about his own covet. Last week in Parshas Korach, he did it himself because it was his own challenge, his own covet which was affected, his own honor, and therefore he said, let the ground open up. He didn't consult HaKadosh Baruch Hu first. But now, people are thirsty, he's not worried about his own covet, he'll go back to his old ways of operating. It's all to do with his covet, that's a potential Chil Hashem. It was wrong, but it was a potential Chil Hashem. There was a potential Chil Hashem there. And that's Pshat, I think, in the Sefer Ikrim. So an astonishing insight in the Sefer Ikrim. Again, just to summarize, what have we said? The Sefer Ikrim says that the Chil Hashem of Mei Meriva was that all the other times, the Nevi'im and Tzaddikim down the generations just control Teva. They intervene directly. Not Moshe Rabbeinu. And therefore, since Moshe Rabbeinu missed the opportunity of controlling Teva, of demonstrating that some Yechidei Skula have mastery over nature, that was a Chil Hashem. What does that mean? Says Rabbi Frand, and that ultimately is the Meshech Chochmah, but that's not how Moshe Rabbeinu operated. He always consulted with Hashem. So what exactly is this accusation against Moshe Rabbeinu? Maybe, says the Meshech Chochmah, it's as follows. That Moshe Rabbeinu was different to all other Nevi'im. He had a communion and a connection with HaKadosh Baruch Hu different to anybody else. He had Aspaklara Me'ira. He could see with a clear vision. And therefore, all other Nevi'im, it was so clear that it was coming from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there was no mistaken possibility that this Navi was a deity. But Moshe Rabbeinu, there is that concern, because he's just different, and maybe it's coming from himself. Therefore, Moshe Rabbeinu, to counter that possible misunderstanding, he always asked for HaKadosh Baruch Hu for guidance beforehand. So people wouldn't think that he's a deity. The only time he didn't was with Korach, for good reason, because they were questioning his authority. No one's going to assume that he's a god then. They're questioning his authority as tool of being a leader. The problem was the following week he went back to his normal way of operating, his normal modus operandi, and he went back and he said, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, what should I do? They want water. There was a little bit of a Chil Hashem, because people might mistakenly say, last week, it was your own covet, you intervened directly. Now, because you're not worried about other people when they're thirsty, but we know why Moshe Rabbeinu did it, but because there was a small Chil Hashem, nevertheless, that was his slight error, and says the Meshech Chochmah, maybe that's Pshat in the Sefer Ikrim. So two very important themes emerge from this week's Parsha. Number one, Chukas HaTorah, an understanding of what a chok is, Ta'amei HaMitzvahs, the famous Beis Halevi in Parshas Bay, with the chok of the Torah, of the quintessential chok of Parah Aduma. To understand that the real reasons are not known to us, and that's true for all mitzvahs ultimately. And even though we may have Ta'amei HaMitzvahs, but they're not contingent upon those Ta'amei HaMitzvahs, that really is what we're telling the Ben Rosha. And second of all, the Mei Meriva, the very, very interesting Mahalchim of Rashi, Rambam, and many others, but the Sefer Ikrim as explained by the Meshech Chochmah. Okay, thank you.